Humanity's one-word reply shocked the Galactic Council Part 1. The sky above Geneva split open without sound or fire. No explosion marked the arrival, only a slow unfurling of light as the envoy ship from the Galactic Council settled into low orbit. It was shaped like a smooth obsidian teardrop, longer than 3 city blocks, and it cast no shadow. People on the ground stopped walking. Cars halted mid-street and birds fell silent as if the world itself held its breath. Inside the United Earth Diplomatic Chamber, Ambassador Carl Dixon stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the live feed from Orbital Defense. Beside him, scientific liaison Lisa Moran tapped her fingers once against the edge of the table, then stilled them. They had known this moment would come. They just never thought it would feel so heavy. The Council's message arrived minutes later. It came not as sound or text, but as a pulse of structured thought that every human on the planet received at once. The words formed in minds like memories they never lived. You have reached the threshold. Your species is now visible. Present your case within 72 hours or be placed under permanent quarantine. The tone was not cruel. It was calm, ancient, and utterly indifferent. Carl exhaled slowly. Lisa turned to the window and watched the clouds drift as if nothing had changed. But everything had. The Galactic Council was not a myth. For centuries, fringe scientists and dreamers had whispered about it. But now it was real. A coalition of over 200 civilizations that kept order across the spiral arm. They did not conquer. They evaluated. And if a species failed their standards, technological stability, social cohesion, ethical maturity, it was sealed away, never to reach the stars. Earth had barely survived its own wars, its climate collapse, its reckless leaps into artificial intelligence. The Council had been watching for decades, maybe longer, and now they had decided humanity was ready for judgment. In the hours that followed, emergency sessions erupted in every capital. Presidents, prime ministers, generals, and philosophers argued through encrypted channels. Some urged humility. Others demanded a show of force. A few even suggested launching every nuclear weapon into orbit as a warning. But Carl and Lisa knew none of that would work. The Council had seen empires rise and burn. They had watched entire biospheres turn to glass. Earth's threats were child's play to them. What mattered was not what humanity could destroy, but what it could become. By the second day, a quiet idea began to spread. It started in online forums, then in university halls, then in neighborhood cafes. People weren't asking how to impress the Council. They were asking what word best described who they were. Not their weapons, not their failures, but their spirit. Someone suggested hope. Another said endure. A poet in Kansas wrote still here. The conversation grew until it became a global pulse. Governments tried to control it, but the people had already taken hold of the moment. For the first time in generations, Earth spoke as one. Carl and Lisa watched the data stream in real time. Anonymous votes poured in from every continent, every language, every age. The system filtered duplicates and bots, leaving only raw human choice. After 36 hours, one word rose above all others. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't grand. But it carried centuries of weight. It was a word whispered in trenches, carved into prison walls, spoken at gravesides, and shouted in revolutions. It was the word that followed every fall and preceded every rise. They did not announce it. They did not explain. At the 71st hour, from a single transmitter in Switzerland, Earth sent its reply. Just one word. Encoded in the same thought pulse the Council had used. No preamble. No signature. Just the word, clean and clear, echoing into the void. Aboard the envoy ship, Emissary Cavor received the message. He was a being of living crystal. Tall and angular, with facets that shifted color with his emotions. His species had not spoken aloud in 10,000 years. They communicated through harmonic resonance, memory light, and shared silence. When the human word reached him, his core flickered from deep violet to a trembling silver. He stood motionless for 17 seconds, an eternity for his kind. Around him, the ship's systems dimmed as if in reverence. On the orbital nexus, the Council's central station, alarms did not sound. Protocols did not activate. Instead, every representative froze. Reptilian diplomats lowered their frilled heads. Gelatinous beings stilled their internal currents. Avian elders folded their wings tight against their bodies. The word had bypassed logic. It had struck something older than law. Back on Earth, Carl finally sat down. Lisa poured 2 cups of coffee and handed him one. Outside, the sun set behind the Alps, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples. No one celebrated. No one panicked. People simply went home. hugged their families, and looked up at the stars with new eyes. They did not know what would happen next, but they knew they had spoken true. Cavor replayed the transmission 3 times. Each time, the word settled deeper into his crystalline lattice, vibrating in patterns his ancestors would have recognized. He had expected data, pleas, or defiance. Not this. Not a single word that held both sorrow and strength, memory and warning. He turned to his aide, a younger envoy named Trell, and pulsed a single harmonic note. Trell's response was a low hum of confusion. Cavor did not answer. He was already composing his report to the High Conclave. 72 hours passed. The deadline came and went. The Council did not quarantine Earth. They did not send warships. They sent silence. And in that silence, humanity waited, not with fear, but with quiet readiness, because they had said what needed to be said. And somewhere in the vast dark between stars, a being made of light and stone was beginning to understand why humans, of all species, might just deserve a second chance. Humanity's one-word reply shocked the Galactic Council Part 2. The silence from the Galactic Council stretched for 3 full days. No new messages came. No ships moved. Earth's orbital sensors showed the envoy vessel still hovering, unmoving like a stone dropped in deep water. On the ground, life tried to return to normal, but nothing felt the same. Children asked their teachers what the word meant. Artists painted it on walls in every language. Old soldiers stood at memorials and whispered it to the wind. The word had been remember, not a demand, not a threat, just a quiet call from a species that had seen too much and forgotten too often. Inside the United Earth Command Center, Carl Dixon and Lisa Moran watched the data streams with tired eyes. They had not slept much since the transmission. Global leaders pressed them for answers, but they had none to give. The Council's silence was more unnerving than anger would have been. Then on the 4th morning, a new signal pulsed through deep space. This one was not for all of humanity. It was addressed only to the Geneva delegation. The message was short. The Council would convene an emergency session. Earth's case would be reviewed in full. Aboard the orbital nexus, the Council chamber hummed with restrained energy. The ring-shaped station hung in the void between stars, its inner corridors lit by soft bioluminescent veins. Representatives from over 200 species gathered in the grand amphitheater, their forms as varied as the worlds they came from. Some floated in fluid-filled spheres, others stood on multiple limbs, and a few existed only as shifting clouds of thought. At the center of it all stood Cavor, his crystalline body casting prismatic reflections across the floor. He had requested this session. He had something to say. He began not with logic or law, but with memory. Using the Council's shared resonance field, he replayed Earth's transmission. The word remember echoed through the chamber, not as sound but as feeling. Then he showed them what he had found in humanity's open archives. Footage of cities rising from rubble, doctors working in war zones with no sleep, strangers pulling each other from floodwaters, students sharing food during famines. Over and over, humans fell, and over. They reached back for each other. It was not perfect, far from it, but it was persistent. Reactions rippled through the assembly. The Varel, a species known for their rigid logic, pulsed disapproval. They argued that emotional resilience was not a valid metric for galactic citizenship. The Zenth, who had lost their own homeworld to civil war, remained silent but attentive. Then Jal spoke. Jal was a reptilian diplomat from the dry moon of Kor, his scales the color of rusted iron. He rarely intervened in council matters, but when he did, others listened. He said that the word remember was not unique to humans. His ancestors had used a similar phrase before their great collapse. It meant more than recall. It meant, do not repeat. It was a warning wrapped in hope. Debate flared. Some species called for immediate quarantine, citing humanity's history of violence and environmental destruction. Others pointed out that many council members had similar pasts. The gelatinous mirth reminded everyone that their own species once consumed entire ecosystems before learning balance. The avian clith admitted their ancestors waged sky wars that blackened their sun for decades. The truth was uncomfortable. Humanity was not special in its flaws. What made them different was how openly they carried their scars, and how often they tried to heal them. Meanwhile, on Earth, the public waited. News channels showed empty skies and quiet streets. In schools, teachers spoke about responsibility. In factories, workers built shelters not for war, but for storms that were coming sooner and stronger each year. Carl and Lisa received a private message from Jail. It was not official, just a few lines of translated thought. He told them the council was divided but not beyond reason. He believed humanity had a chance, if they could prove their word was more than poetry. That night, Carl walked through a park near the delegation building. The air was cool, the trees rustling softly. He passed a bench where an old man sat with a young girl. They were looking at the stars. The man pointed to a bright point of light, the envoy ship, and said, "That's where they're deciding if we matter." The girl asked, "Do we?" The man smiled and said, "We remember. That's how we know we do." Carl kept walking, his chest tight with something he could not name. Back on the Nexus, Zhal proposed a solution. Instead of judgment based on records alone, let humanity face a trial, not a test of weapons or technology, but of character. Place a small group of them on a dead moon with minimal supplies and no outside help. If they survive 30 days, grant them provisional membership. If they fail, quarantine begins at once. The council debated for hours. Some called it cruel. Others called it fair. In the end, the motion passed by a narrow margin. Carl and Lisa were informed the next morning. They were given 24 hours to choose 20 volunteers. No soldiers. No politicians. Just ordinary people. Engineers, medics, farmers, teachers. People who knew how to build, heal, grow, and teach. People who understood that survival was not just about living, but about keeping others alive too. They sent out the call. Within hours, over 1 million applications poured in, not for glory, but for the chance to show what humanity could do when stripped of everything but will. As names were selected, Daniel Cruz, an aerospace engineer from Arizona, packed a small bag. He had lost his brother in the Pacific floods and had spent the last decade designing water purifiers for refugee camps. Maya Peterson, a field medic from Minnesota, checked her kit for the 10th time. She had served in 3 disaster zones and once carried a child 10 miles through mud to reach a clinic. They did not know each other, but they shared the same quiet resolve. The council ship opened a portal near the moon designated X7. It was barren, airless, and scoured by radiation storms. The volunteers would be dropped with only basic tools, recycled air units, and seeds. No weapons. No comms beyond a single emergency beacon. Their only mission was to survive, and to show the galaxy what remember truly meant. As the shuttle lifted off from Earth, millions watched in silence. There were no cheers, no flags, just hands clasped and eyes raised. Carl and Lisa stood side by side on the roof of the delegation building, watching the streak of light vanish into the sky. They did not know if the volunteers would make it, but they knew this was humanity's best answer, not with force, not with lies, but with simple, stubborn life. And far above, on the orbital nexus, Kavor watched the shuttle's path on his display. For the first time in centuries, he felt something close to curiosity. He wondered if these fragile beings, so quick to hurt and so slow to heal, might teach the Council something it had long forgotten. Humanity's one-word reply shocked the Galactic Council Part 3. The shuttle touched down on Moon X7 with a soft crunch of metal on gray dust. No wind stirred the surface. No birds called. Only silence, thick and endless, wrapped around the 20 humans as they stepped onto the barren rock. Daniel Cruz was the first out, his boots sinking slightly into the fine regolith. He turned and helped Mia Peterson down the ramp, her medical pack strapped tight to her back. Behind them came the others, teachers, farmers, mechanics, a botanist, a carpenter, a former firefighter, all chosen not for strength alone but for what they could give to a group in need. The council had given them a dome-shaped habitat unit, enough air and water for 10 days, nutrient paste for 30, and a box of seeds that might or might not grow in alien soil. No weapons. No power source beyond solar panels that would struggle under the weak light of the system's distant star. Their only real tools were their hands and what they carried in their minds. Daniel checked the horizon. The sky was black even at midday, stars sharp and unmoving. Earth was invisible from here. So was the council ship. They were alone. The first challenge came fast. The habitat unit seal failed during setup. Air hissed out through a hairline crack in the polymer frame. Within hours, oxygen levels dropped. Panic flickered in some eyes, but Mia moved calmly, directing 2 volunteers to patch the breach with sealant foam from the emergency kit. Daniel rerouted the air recycler to compensate. By nightfall, though there was no true night, they had stabilized the shelter. No one slept. They sat in a circle, sharing stories instead. A teacher from Oregon spoke of rebuilding a school after wildfires. A farmer from Iowa described planting crops in poisoned soil, and waiting years for it to heal. They were not boasting. They were remembering. Days passed in a rhythm of work and watchfulness. The botanist, Elena Rojas, tested soil samples under a portable lamp, mixing in organic matter from their waste recyclers. She planted the first seeds in shallow trays, whispering to them like they were children. The carpenter, Jake Mills, salvaged metal scraps from the shuttle's landing gear and built a frame to support a second greenhouse dome. Mia treated blisters, minor burns from faulty wiring and the slow onset of radiation fatigue with limited meds and steady hands. Daniel jury-rigged a moisture trap using reflective sheeting, pulling trace vapor from the ground and condensing it into drinkable water. It was barely enough, but it was something. Then the fauna appeared. Not large, not aggressive by design, but curious. Six-legged creatures the size of dogs with chitinous shells and too many eyes began circling the camp at dusk. They made no sound, but their presence unnerved the group. One volunteer, a young mechanic named Tony, wanted to scare them off with noise. Daniel stopped him. "They're not attacking," he said. "They're watching, like we're the strange ones here." Instead of fighting, they left out scraps of nutrient paste. The creatures sniffed, then ate. Over time, they grew bolder, even docile. Elena named one Rusty for the copper tint on its back. It began sleeping near the greenhouse as if guarding it. On the 12th day, a storm hit. Not rain, there was no atmosphere for that, but a surge of solar radiation from the system's unstable star. Alarms blared inside the habitat. The solar panels overloaded and shut down. Temperatures dropped. The group huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat under thermal blankets. Mia checked vitals every hour. Daniel worked through the night, rewiring the panels with spare parts, his fingers numb and shaking. By dawn, he got one panel working again. Weak light flickered on in the main cabin. No one cheered. They just nodded. That was enough. Tensions rose as fatigue set in. Food ran low. The seeds grew slowly, pale and thin. Arguments flared over ration sizes, over who should take the night watch, over whether they should activate the emergency beacon. But each time someone stepped in, Jake reminded them they had agreed to trust each other before leaving Earth. Elena shared her extra portion with Tony when he fell ill from dehydration. Mia held a silent vigil with a teacher named Grace who missed her students so much she cried into her gloves. They were not heroes. They were tired, scared people choosing again and again to care. On the 18th day, the comms died. A final surge from the storm fried the last relay. The emergency beacon still worked, but the open channel to the Council and to Earth went dark. No more updates. No more voices from home. The silence was heavier than the moon's gravity. That night, someone started singing. It was an old folk song, simple and slow, about rivers and home. One by one, others joined. Their voices were rough, off-key, but together they filled the dome with something warm. Far above, unseen, Council observers recorded the transmission. They did not understand the words, but they felt the harmony. The song became a ritual. Every evening after work, they gathered and sang. Sometimes it was a lullaby, sometimes a work chant, sometimes just humming. It was how they remembered who they were. On the 25th day, Rust the creature brought them a gift. A smooth black stone that glowed faintly in the dark. Elena placed it in the center of the dome. It gave off a soft warmth. No one knew why, but they accepted it like a promise. On the 29th day, disaster struck. A tremor, minor by planetary standards, collapsed part of the ridge above the habitat. Rock and dust buried the east wing, trapping Jake, Grace, and two others inside. Oxygen levels dropped fast in the sealed section. Daniel and Mia led the rescue. With no heavy tools, they dug by hand, passing buckets of rubble down a human chain. Tony rigged a pulley from shuttle cables. Elena monitored the trapped group's vitals through a crack in the wall. For 6 hours, they worked without rest. When the last slab was lifted and the four emerged coughing but alive, no one spoke. They just held each other. The trial ended at sunrise on the 30th day. The Council ship descended silently, its ramp lowering without fanfare. Observers in sleek suits stepped out, their faces unreadable behind visors. They scanned the camp, the patched dome, the struggling plants. The creature curled near the entrance, the faces lined with exhaustion, but clear-eyed. Daniel stood at the front, his clothes torn, his hands raw. He did not bow. He did not plead. He simply said, "We're ready." As they boarded the shuttle, Maya looked back once. The dome stood small against the vast gray plain. It was not much, but it was theirs. And it was proof. Proof that even on a dead world, humans could build something that breathed. High above, on the orbital nexus, Kavor watched the feed. He saw the singing. He saw the rescue. He saw the creature nudge Mia's hand before she left. He turned to Jal and pulsed a single, clear tone. Jal understood. It meant they remembered. And in that moment, the Council's oldest law began to crack. Humanity's one-word reply shocked the Galactic Council Part 4. The return of the 20 volunteers sent ripples through the Galactic Council that no war or treaty ever could. They arrived not as prisoners or petitioners, but as witnesses. Their bodies were thin, their skin marked by radiation burns and scrapes. But their eyes held a quiet steadiness that unsettled even the oldest council members. They were given quarters on the orbital nexus, not in detention, but in guest wings usually reserved for honored envoys. No one had expected them to survive. Fewer still expected them to change minds. Kavor spent hours reviewing every second of the trial footage. He watched Daniel reroute power with trembling hands. He saw Mia share her last dose of painkiller with a feverish volunteer. He heard the song they sang each night, simple and raw, echoing through the empty dome. But what held him longest was the moment after the cave-in rescue. The group did not celebrate. They sat in silence, passing a single canteen, their shoulders touching. It was not discipline. It was instinct. They leaned on each other because they knew no other way to stand. Driven by a curiosity he could not name, Kavor requested access to Earth's full historical archive. Not the curated summaries, but the raw, unfiltered records. Newsreels, personal diaries, school lessons, protest chants, lullabies, even old radio broadcasts. For 3 days he absorbed it all. He saw cities burn and rise again. He watched children hand bread to strangers during famines. He heard a president speak of peace while missiles sat fueled in silos. Humanity was not consistent, but it was persistent. And woven through every era, in every language, was the word remember. He found it carved into the walls of prisons, whispered by soldiers in trenches, printed on the first page of schoolbooks after wars. It was not just a word, it was a practice. A warning to the powerful, a promise to the lost, a compass for the lost. Kavor realized then that humanity had not defied the Council. They had reminded it. Reminded them of something the galaxy had forgotten. That survival is not measured in weapons or wealth, but in how a species treats its weakest when no one is watching. Meanwhile, Shal moved quietly through the council corridors. He met with the Mirth, whose gelatinous forms rippled with unease. He spoke with the Clith elders who preened their feathers in thoughtful silence. He reminded them of their own histories. The Mirth once devoured entire ecosystems before learning to give back. The Clith had nearly wiped themselves out in sky wars over territory. Every species on the council had a dark age. What set humanity apart was that they named theirs. They taught it to their young. They built monuments not just to victory, but to failure. Back on the Nexus guest level, Daniel and Maya were asked to speak with a small group of council observers. They did not give speeches. They answered questions. When asked why they sang, Maya said it was how they kept fear from turning into panic. When asked why they shared food even when hungry, Daniel said because hunger shared is easier to bear. They spoke of Rust the creature, of how it seemed to understand their rhythm, of how it stayed near the greenhouse like a silent guardian. One observer, a young Vrel with silver eyes, asked if they had ever considered giving up. Mia looked at Daniel, then said, "Every day." But someone always said, "Not yet." That phrase spread through the station. Not yet. It appeared in private messages, in council notes, even in the resonance logs of elder diplomats. It carried the same weight as remember, a refusal to surrender, not out of pride but out of care for those still standing beside you. On Earth, people watched the news with bated breath. There were no parades, no victory chants. Instead, communities gathered in parks and squares holding candles or planting trees. A school in Portland named its new greenhouse after Elena Rojas. A fire station in Detroit hung a photo of Jake Mills with the words, "He dug until the light came back." Humanity was not waiting for permission to be worthy. It was living as if it already was. Kavor compiled his findings into a formal report. He did not argue with data or precedent. He showed moments, a medic carrying a wounded enemy to safety, a farmer sharing seeds after a drought, a child giving her coat to a stranger in the snow. He ended with the trial footage, the rescue, the song, the creature's gift. Then he added one final clip, the original transmission from Geneva. Just the word, remember. He presented it to the High Conclave in the central chamber. This time, The silence was different, not cold but heavy with thought. The Vrel representative, who had opposed humanity from the start, pulsed a low, questioning tone. Why should we trust a species that destroys its own home? Kavor responded not with defense but with a question of his own. Have you ever rebuilt what you broke? The Vrel did not answer, but their light dimmed slightly as if in memory. Jal stood then. He spoke of his own people's near extinction, how they survived not by forgetting their mistakes but by teaching them in every generation. They are not asking to be perfect, he said. They are asking to try, and they are asking us to remember that trying is the bravest thing a species can do. As the debate continued, word reached the volunteers that the council was considering full review, a rare procedure that could grant humanity provisional membership with full rights. It would mean access to shared knowledge, medical advances, even travel corridors. But it would also mean responsibility. Humanity would be expected to uphold the council's core values. Daniel asked what those values were. A young aide replied, peace, balance, and memory. Daniel smiled faintly. We know memory. On the 29th night aboard the Nexus, Mia stood at the observation deck watching Earth hang in the black like a blue jewel. Daniel joined her. They did not speak for a long time. Finally, she said, do you think they'll say yes? He looked at the planet, at the swirls of cloud and continent, at the lights of cities blinking like stars turned inside out. I think, he said, they already have. Because far below in towns and labs and classrooms humans were still building, healing, teaching, and remembering. And somewhere in the council chambers a being of crystal and light was drafting a motion that would change galactic law forever, not by adding a rule, but by restoring an old one. The principle of remembrance. And as the vote drew near, the entire station seemed to hold its breath, waiting not for judgment, but for recognition. Humanity's one-word reply shocked the Galactic Council Part 5. The day of the final vote arrived without fanfare. No trumpets sounded in the orbital nexus. No banners hung in the grand chamber. Only the soft hum of life support, and the quiet pulse of thought resonance filled the air as every council seat was taken. Species that had not attended a full conclave in centuries appeared through shimmering portals. Elders wrapped in memory silk, scholars carried in fluid cradles, warriors whose armor bore scars from wars no record still named. They came not out of duty but curiosity. Humanity had done something no emerging species had ever done. It had made the council look inward. Carl Dixon and Lisa Moran stood at the center of the chamber, not on a platform, but on the same floor as the delegates. They wore simple Earth-made suits, no insignia, no medals. They had been given the right to speak, but they chose silence. They knew words were no longer needed. What mattered now was whether the council had listened. Kavor rose first. His crystalline form glowed with a steady silver light as he projected his final report. He did not speak of technology or treaties. He spoke of moments. He showed the rescue on Moon X7 again, but this time slowed to single frames. The hand reaching through dust, the shared breath in the dark, the way Mia checked Jake's pulse before her own. Then he showed older footage from Earth. A nurse holding a stranger's hand during a plague. A student giving her lunch to a classmate with empty pockets. A man planting a tree in a war-torn square, knowing he would never see it grow. They do not remember to boast, Kavor resonated. They remember to avoid repeating. That is not weakness. That is wisdom wearing humble clothes, Jal followed. He spoke of his people's near destruction, how they survived only because the young refused to forget the old mistakes. We sealed our history in stone so our children would not have to learn through fire, he said. Humanity writes its history in action. Every day, they choose to rebuild what they broke. That is not stability. That is courage. Then, to everyone's surprise, the Vrel representative stood. Their form shimmered from cold blue to a softer green. We judge them by our standards, they pulsed. But perhaps the galaxy needs new standards. If remembering pain can lead to protecting others, then their flaw is also their strength. It was not an apology, but it was close. The vote began. Each species cast its choice not with words, but with light. A warm glow meant yes. A dim pulse meant no. The chamber filled with rising radiance as one by one, the lights turned gold. Some hesitated. A few remained dark. But when the count settled, the result was clear. The motion passed. Humanity was granted provisional membership with full rights. More than that, the council amended its founding charter. A new clause was added. The principle of remembrance shall guide all judgments of emerging species. To remember is to honor the past and protect the future. Carl exhaled. Lisa closed her eyes for just a second. They did not cheer. They bowed slightly, then stepped back. There would be work ahead. Negotiations, integration, learning the vast web of galactic law. But for now, they simply stood together, two humans in a room of stars, holding the weight of their species with quiet dignity. On Earth, the news spread fast, but there were no fireworks. No mass celebrations. In New York, a teacher wrote "Remember" on the board and asked her students what it meant to them. In Nairobi, a group of engineers shared blueprints for clean water systems with a visiting Mirth delegation. In Buenos Aires, an old woman placed a single flower at a memorial for climate refugees and whispered, "We did not forget you." Humanity celebrated not with noise, but with action. The volunteers returned home one by one. Daniel Cruz went back to Arizona and helped design a new generation of desert farms using techniques he'd tested on the moon. Maya Peterson opened a clinic in Minnesota that trained medics in both emergency care and community healing. Elena Rojas and Jake Mills started a project to rebuild forests using seeds from every continent, calling it the Remember Grove. Even Rust, the six-legged creature from X7, was not forgotten. A small habitat was built in a protected research zone, and Elena visited often, bringing black stones that glowed in the dark. Weeks later, Carl and Lisa stood on a hill outside Geneva, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft reds and purples. The envoy ship was gone, but a new council relay station now orbited quietly above the poles, sharing data, not demands. "What do we do now?" Lisa asked. Carl looked at the stars beginning to appear. "We keep remembering," he said. "And we help others remember too." Far beyond the solar system, in the deep void where no council ship had ever gone, a new signal pulsed from Earth. It was not aimed at any known world. It carried no coordinates, no plea, no threat, just one word, broadcast on a wide open frequency drifting into the unknown. Remember, somewhere out there, another young species might be watching the stars, wondering if they mattered, and when that word reached them, soft and steady like a heartbeat, they might choose to try. And that was enough.